The bat was already coming down when I got my forearm up to meet it. I want to be honest about that first half second because everything that came after depends on it. I did not see a face. I did not see a man. I saw a shape lunge out of the shadow between two shuttered stalls, and I saw a length of pale wood catch the one weak lamp still burning over the kitchen gate, and every year of training I had ever done collapsed into a single motion: step in, not back, take the blow on the bone built to take it, close the distance before he can wind up for a second swing. The bat cracked across my forearm hard enough to numb it to the fingers. Then my other hand had his wrist, and I had turned my hip into him, and he was on the cobblestones with the bat spinning away into the dark, and my knee across his shoulder blades before either of us had taken a full breath. He didn't fight me. That was the first thing that struck me as wrong. A man who swings a bat at a king's guard in the dead of night, at a service gate, 20 feet from a wall he could still have gone over, that man, in my experience, either runs the instant the swing fails, or he fights with everything he has because he has already decided the night is going badly, and he means to make it cost me something. This man did neither. He went still under my knee like something in him had simply switched off, and then he made a sound that I have turned over in my mind more times than I can count since, not a growl, not a curse, but a kind of collapsing breath, the sound a man makes when the last thing holding him upright gives way. "Please," he said into the stones. "Please, I didn't mean." I did not loosen my grip. You do not loosen your grip because a man says please. I have been a king's guard for 11 years, the last 6 of them posted around the palace at Harrowgate, and I have heard pleas from men who meant to put a knife in me the moment I gave them the room to try it. But I will tell you what I did do, because it is the whole reason I am writing any of this down. I looked at his hand before I looked at his face. It is a habit, you check the weapon hand first, always before anything else, and his hand, pinned flat against the cobbles under mine, was shaking so hard that I could feel the tremor through my own glove. Not the shake of a man bracing to strike again. The shake of a man who has been holding something together with both hands for so long that the moment it breaks, everything in him breaks with it. "Stay down," I told him, low and even, the way we are trained to speak, not loud, not soft, just flat and certain, a voice that leaves no room to argue with it. "Don't move and nothing more happens to you tonight." "I know," he said. "I know, I'm not going to fight you. I couldn't fight you if I wanted to." And then, absurdly, apologetically, from a man face down on cold stone with a guard's knee between his shoulders, "I'm sorry about your arm. My name is Doran Ashcombe, and at the time all of this happened I had spent 11 years in the King's Guard, and a little over 2,000 nights standing posts. I was not permitted to leave for anything short of duty or death. Most of those nights, nothing happens. I want to say that plainly because the stories people tell about men like me are always the nights something happens. The slap, the spit, the drawn weapon, the drunk with more confidence than sense. And it can start to sound as though we spend our whole careers being tested by fools and villains. We do not. We spend most of our careers in a kind of patient, practiced stillness, watching gates that nothing comes through, listening to a city sleep. It is a strange discipline to master, standing guard against a thing that almost never comes. But you master it anyway, because the one night it does come, everyone standing near you is depending on the fact that you never let your attention soften. Not once, not for one quiet hour on one quiet street. That particular night had been quiet right up until it wasn't. I had drawn the overnight watch at the kitchen gate, the low service entrance on the palace's eastern wall, well away from the tall iron gates and the guardhouses the tourists photograph by daylight. It is an unglamorous post. Delivery vans come through it before dawn, carrying flour and produce and cases of wine down into the palace stores. Kitchen staff use it for their own comings and goings on the early and late shifts. And directly across the narrow lane from it sits Cooper's Row, a small market square that has stood in that spot, by local reckoning, since before the current wing of the palace was built. A cluster of stalls that during the day sell vegetables and cut flowers and second-hand books, and that at night stand shuttered and dark except for the one lamp the district keeps burning at the corner, more out of habit than need. I had walked that lane 1,000 times. I knew the sound the loose flagstone made near the third stall, the smell of the fish cart 2 doors down even hours after it had closed, the exact hour, a little after 2, when the first of the palace's produce deliveries would begin arriving from the wholesale market outside the city. I knew it the way you know the inside of your own house in the dark, by feel rather than by looking. Which is precisely why, when a shadow moved wrong among the stalls at 1:30 that morning, I noticed it before I could have told you what I'd noticed. I did not draw down on him. I want that understood too, because it matters for everything that follows. I had my sidearm, every guard on a night post does. I did not reach for it. 11 years teaches you to read a shape in the dark faster than you can put words to what you're reading, and something about the way this shape moved, hunched low over a stacked crate of produce outside the shuttered greengrocer's stall, working at something with both hands, glancing up every few seconds toward the lane and then back down, quick and jerky, told me this was not a man closing in on a fight. It told me this was a man trying badly not to be seen. "You there?" I said, stepping out from the gate's shadow into the lane, my voice pitched to carry without shouting. "Step away from the crate." That was when he swung. I have thought hard about whether I could have prevented that swing, whether some other approach on my part, quieter, from a different angle, a different first word, might have kept it from happening at all. I have decided, after a great deal of turning it over, that I could not have. A man that far gone in panic does not calculate his response to variables. He reacts to the one fact in front of him. A king's guard, tall, uniformed, unmistakable even in near dark, closing the distance toward him in the dead of night, and his body answers before his mind has finished forming a thought. He had a length of wood already in his hand, from whatever he'd been doing to that crate, and when I moved toward him it came up and around in one wild, untrained arc, thrown with far more fear than force. I do not believe, to this day, that he meant to seriously hurt me. I believe he meant to make me stop long enough for him to run. He did not get the chance to run, because I was already moving, and 11 years of drilling took over from there in the space of about a second and a half. Which brings us back to where I began, his wrist in my hand, my knee across his shoulders, the bat spinning off somewhere into the dark, and a grown man underneath me shaking like a struck bell and apologizing for my arm. "Stop talking," I told him, not unkindly, and keyed the small radio clipped at my collar. "Kitchen gate, this is Ashcombe. I have one man detained, non-lethal force used, no serious injury to either party, requesting backup and a constable." The response crackled back within seconds, Harlow, the young guard who'd been posted at the main gatehouse that night, telling me he was 3 minutes out. I acknowledged and clicked off, and in the gap of quiet that followed, before Harlow's boots came echoing down the lane, I did something that was not strictly in the manual. I looked at what the man had been trying to pry open. It was a single crate, one of a dozen stacked outside the greengrocer's shutters, awaiting the morning's first delivery run into the palace kitchens. Mixed vegetables, mostly, the kind of stock that gets sorted and split between the palace stores and half the restaurants in the district before the sun is properly up. The lid was half off, splintered where he'd been working at it, and inside I could see nothing more dramatic than potatoes, a net bag of onions, and a scatter of apples that had rolled loose against the slats. Not a jewel box, not a strong box, vegetables. And beside the crate, where it had come to rest after I'd knocked it from his hand, lay the bat. I want to describe that bat carefully, because it is, in its own small way, the hinge on which this whole story turns. It was not new. It was not the sort of thing a man buys with violence in mind, scuffed pale wood, the grip worn dark and smooth by years of handling, a hairline crack running up one side that had been patched, at some point, with a wrap of electrical tape gone gray with age. And low on the barrel, in the faded, careful block letters of a child who has just learned to write her own name and is proud of it, someone had printed a single word in marker long since worn to a ghost of itself. CASS. I did not need to be told, in that moment, what I was looking at. I had 2 nieces of my own back then, and I knew exactly what a well-loved, hand-me-down child's bat looked like. The kind bought second-hand or passed down from an older cousin. The kind a father keeps in a hall closet for the summer evenings when there's a patch of grass and 20 free minutes, and nothing in the world matters more than teaching a small person how to hit a ball. It was not a weapon. It had never once, in its whole life before that night, been meant as a weapon. Somebody had grabbed it off a wall or out of a closet or from behind a door, because it was the nearest thing shaped like a lever, the nearest thing that might pry a lid free of a nailed crate, and it had ended up in his hand at the one moment he could least afford to be holding anything at all. I looked back down at him. He had turned his head to one side against the cobblestones, and in the light from the corner lamp I got my first real look at his face. A man perhaps in his mid-30s, unshaven in the way of someone who has stopped keeping track of such things rather than someone who has chosen not to, hollow under the eyes, a coat that had once fit him and now hung loose at the shoulders the way clothes do on a man who has lost weight he did not have to spare. He was not looking at me. He was looking past me at the crate, at the split lid and the spilled apples, and his face had the particular, terrible stillness of a man watching the very last of his plans come apart in front of him. "What's your name?" I asked him. He didn't answer right away. I asked again, the same flat, even tone, and this time he answered in a voice gone hoarse and small. "Walter," he said, "Walter Fenn." "All right, Walter Fenn." I eased my knee back just slightly, enough to let him breathe without releasing the wrist lock that kept him from doing anything sudden. "You're not going anywhere tonight, but I want you to understand something before my colleague gets here, because it's going to matter in about 2 minutes. Right now this looks like an assault on a guard and an attempted theft, and those are 2 very serious things, and I am not going to pretend otherwise to make you feel better. But I noticed something just now, and I'd like you to tell me if I've got it wrong. That bat's got a little girl's name on it. Is that your daughter's?" Something happened in his face then that I have seen only a handful of times in 11 years of standing posts, where men come apart in front of me. The sudden, total collapse of whatever thin composure had been left holding him together. He made a sound that was not quite a sob and not quite a laugh, the sound of a man hearing the one true thing about himself, said aloud by a stranger who had no reason to say it kindly. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, it's hers. I swear to you, I wasn't going to hurt anybody. I just needed," his voice broke apart there entirely, and for a moment all he could do was breathe against the stones, his shoulders shaking under my hand. "I just needed to get that crate open before the truck came. That's all. I wasn't going to hurt anybody." Harlow's boots came around the corner of the lane at a run just then, and behind him, moving at a brisker pace than usual, the on-duty constable who patrolled the district's back streets on the overnight shift, a heavy-set, steady man named Osler whom I'd worked alongside more times than I could count. I got to my feet, drawing Walter Fenn up with me by the arm, not roughly, keeping the wrist lock loose but present, the kind of hold that says I could hurt you and won't rather than I am hurting you now. He came up unsteady, his knees not quite trusting the ground, and stood swaying slightly between us in the lamp light with his head down. "Ashcombe," Harlow was breathing hard, hand already dropping toward his own radio. "You good?" Report said non-lethal force. "I'm fine," I said, and rolled my forearm to prove it, though it throbbed under the sleeve badly enough that I already suspected there'd be a bruise the length of my whole arm by morning. Attempted theft from the greengrocer's crate, resisted with a blunt object when I approached. He's detained. No further resistance. I looked past Harlow to Osler, who was already crouching to examine the splintered crate lid with the flat, unhurried competence of a man who had processed 1,000 petty incidents in this district, and expected this to be the 1001st. Osler, before you write this up as a straightforward theft and assault, I want 2 minutes with you. Osler glanced up, one eyebrow lifting slightly, not skeptical exactly, more the look of a man recalibrating. In 6 years working the same stretch of the city, we had built up the kind of working trust that lets a request like that land without needing explanation. 2 minutes, he said. He's not going anywhere. Harlow's got him. I walked a few paces down the lane with Osler out of Walter Finn's hearing, and told him what I'd seen: the bat, the child's name worn into the wood, the shaking hands, the apology for my arm, the crate that held nothing but vegetables. Osler listened the way good constables listen, without interrupting, his eyes tracking back once or twice toward the man standing slump-shouldered under the lamp with Harlow's hand light on his shoulder. "Doesn't change the charges," Osler said when I'd finished. It wasn't unkind. It was simply true. Assault on a guard is assault on a guard, whatever the reason behind it. Attempted theft is attempted theft, whether it's diamonds or potatoes. The law doesn't have a lesser box for desperate. "I know that," I said. "I'm not asking you to change what you write down. I'm asking you to let me talk to him properly, before this becomes a file that gets handled by people who never saw his face when I asked about that bat." Osler studied me for a moment in the near dark, the lamp light catching the gray already coming in at his temples. He had children of his own, I knew, 3 of them, the eldest not far off from being grown. Whatever calculation passed behind his eyes, it did not take him long to run it. "You've got till the wagon gets here," he said. "After that, he's processed same as anyone. But talk fast, Ashcombe, and for what it's worth." He was already turning back toward the crate, already reaching for the small notebook he carried on every shift. "I've seen worse men swing worse things for worse reasons than a girl who needs breakfast. Doesn't make it right. Might make it matter when it comes time for someone to decide what happens to him next." I did not know, standing in that lane with my forearm throbbing, and a stranger's daughter's name still burned into my mind, that those words from Osler would turn out to be the truest thing said that night. I only knew that I had perhaps 10 minutes before a wagon arrived to take Walter Finn to a cell, and that whatever I learned in those 10 minutes was very likely to be the only unguarded version of his story that anyone in a position to help him would ever hear. I walked back to where Harlow stood with him. Walter Finn had not moved, had not tried to. He stood with his head bowed, watching his own scuffed shoes on the cobblestones, and when I stopped in front of him he flinched slightly, as though bracing for a blow that did not come. "Walter," I said, "look at me." It took him a moment. When he finally lifted his head, his eyes were wet, and ashamed of being wet, and he blinked hard against it in the particular way of a man who has trained himself for months not to cry in front of anyone and is furious at himself for nearly failing now. "I need you to tell me what happened tonight," I said. "Not what you think will get you out of trouble, what actually happened. You've got about 10 minutes before that stops being your choice, and I would rather hear it from you than read it later in a file that gets it wrong." He looked at me for a long moment, searching my face for the trick in it, the way a man who has been failed by enough people learns to search every offer of kindness for the hook hidden inside it. I do not know exactly what he found there. But whatever it was enough, because his shoulders dropped another inch, and the fight, what little of it had ever been in him, went out of him entirely, and he began, in a voice still hoarse from the sob he'd swallowed, to tell me how he had come to be standing in Cooper's Row Market at 1:30 in the morning with his daughter's baseball bat in his hand. "I lost my job in the spring," he said. "Harrowgate Freight and Storage. I was on the loading floor 11 years. Same as you, I guess, only nobody claps for a warehouse man. A ghost of something that might once have been humor flickered and died in his face. They cut the whole overnight crew when the contract with the shipping line fell through. 22 of us gone in one meeting. I've put in for every job I know how to do since then. Loading, driving, groundskeeping, anything." I had 2 interviews in 4 months. Neither one called back. He told it plainly, without embellishment, the way men tell the truth when they have stopped having the energy to make it sound better or worse than it was. His wife, Myrle, had come down with a fever 3 weeks earlier that had not broken the way it should have, in fact, worsened into something in her chest that made her cough through the nights, and left her too weak most days to do more than sit up in bed. He had taken her to the free clinic twice. Twice they had told him she needed proper medicine, and a few days somewhere warm and dry with someone able to look after her. And twice he had walked out with a slip of paper listing what she needed, and not enough money in his pocket to fill half of it. 2 daughters, Etta, 9, and Cass, 5, whose bat now lay forgotten on the cobblestones a few feet from where we stood, had been staying the last week with Myrle's sister across the district. Because Walter could not both nurse his wife and mind 2 small children, and also spend every daylight hour walking from one shuttered opportunity to the next. That day, the day that had ended, hours later, with a bat swung in the dark, he had gone first to the Palace Kitchen's delivery office, having heard from another out-of-work man at the relief line that they sometimes took on day labor to help unload the early trucks. He had walked the better part of 2 hours to get there and arrived to be told, politely enough, that the days list was already filled and had been since before dawn. They took names sometimes for the following week, but made no promises. He had given his name anyway, the way you give your name at every door that might open, even the ones you know in your gut are already closed. Then he had gone to the district relief office, the one place left in the city that still administered emergency food vouchers and small hardship grants to families in exactly his position, only to find, after another long walk and a wait in a line that moved like tar, that the office closed its intake window at 4 in the afternoon, and that his bus, delayed twice by road work, had put him at the door at 6 minutes past. 6 minutes, he said, and his voice cracked clean in half on the number. I stood outside the glass and watched the woman behind the counter turn the sign around. 6 minutes. And I actually thought, standing there, that if I'd run the last 3 blocks instead of walking them, I'd have made it. I keep doing that. Running the 6 minutes back in my head, over and over, like it's going to come out different if I just think about it hard enough. He had gone home to an apartment with an eviction notice already taped inside the door, to a wife too weak to sit up and ask him how the day had gone, and to a cupboard that held, by his own accounting, half a bag of rice and nothing else. And somewhere in the hours after midnight, lying awake beside Myrle listening to her labored breathing, he had thought about the produce crates he'd seen stacked every night outside the market on his walk home from the relief office, crates that sat unattended for hours before the morning trucks came to collect them. And something in him that had never once, in 34 years of an honest life, considered taking a single thing that wasn't his, had simply broken. I told myself it was 1 crate, he said. 1 crate of vegetables nobody would even miss come morning, off a stack of a dozen headed for a kitchen that throws away more food in a week than my girls eat in a month. I told myself I'd pay it back somehow someday, when things turned around. I grabbed Cass's bat off the hook by the door because I didn't have a crowbar and I didn't know what else might pry a lid loose, and I told myself. He stopped, pressed the heel of his hand hard against one eye, and when he took it away, his voice had gone very quiet. I told myself a lot of things standing in that lane, guardsman. None of them were true. I'm not a thief. I've never stolen anything in my life. I don't even know who I was tonight. Behind us, down the lane, I could hear the low rumble of the transport wagon approaching, its headlamps beginning to throw long shapes against the shuttered stalls. Osler had finished his notes on the crate and was straightening, glancing our way, and I understood without needing to check my own watch that whatever window I had been given was closing. When you saw me, I said, what did you think was going to happen? Walter Fenn looked at me then with an honesty so unguarded it was almost unbearable to receive. I thought you were going to arrest me, he said, And I thought about my girls finding out their fathers in a cell for stealing vegetables. And I thought about Myra lying there with no one to bring her the medicine. And for about 1 second, I swear to you, none of that felt survivable. I didn't decide to swing that bat. I don't think I decided anything. I think I just stopped being able to hold it, whatever it was I'd been holding, and it came out of my hands before I even knew what I was doing. He shook his head slowly, as though even now he could not quite believe the last hour of his own life. I have never hit anyone. Not once. Not my whole life. And I nearly took a guard's head off tonight over a crate of potatoes, and I don't know how a man gets from where I started to where I ended up tonight. I don't know how that happens. I have asked myself many times since why that answer struck me the way it did. I think it is because I recognized something true in it that had nothing to do with excusing what he'd done and everything to do with understanding it. I had grown up the son of a man who had, for one terrible winter when I was 9 years old, lost his own position at the shipyard and spent 4 months watching the last of our family's savings disappear into rent and heat and the slow arithmetic of not quite enough. My father had not swung a bat at anyone. But I remembered, even at 9, the particular silence that had settled over our house that winter, the way my mother's face had changed shape around the eyes, the specific, wordless terror of watching 2 grown adults try to hide from their children exactly how close to the edge they were standing. I did not know, in that moment in the lane, whether I was going to be able to do anything at all for Walter Fenn. But I knew that what I had just heard was not the confession of a criminal explaining away a crime. It was the confession of a man describing, in real time, the worst thing that had ever happened to him. The night his own decency finally gave out under a weight it was never built to carry alone. The wagon pulled up at the mouth of the lane, its doors already swinging open. An ostler came toward us with his notebook closed under one arm, and the particular measured pace of a man about to do a job he has done 1,000 times and on this occasion does not especially want to be doing. "Time," he said quietly, not unkindly to me. And then to Walter Fenn in the flat, procedural voice constables use precisely so that the words themselves carry no cruelty even when the moment does. "Walter Fenn, you're being detained on suspicion of assault against a member of the King's Guard and attempted theft. You'll be transported to the district holding facility, where you'll be permitted to contact family, and if you wish, arrange legal counsel before any formal charges are filed. Do you understand?" Walter Fenn nodded. He did not fight the cuffs Ostler brought out, did not so much as tense against them, only stood with his eyes fixed somewhere past all of us, on nothing, on the middle distance where a man's whole ruined night finally settles into something too heavy to look at directly. As Ostler turned him gently toward the wagon, I bent and picked up the bat from where it had lain forgotten on the cobblestone since the moment it left his hand, the worn grip, the taped crack, CASS in its fading marker letters. "This is going into evidence with everything else," I told him, holding it up so he could see it. "But I want you to know I saw the name on it before anyone else did. That's going to matter. I promise you that much." He looked at the bat, and then at me, and something crossed his face that was not quite hope. It was too early, and he was too far gone in shame for anything as bright as hope, but it was not nothing, either. It was the first flicker of a man realizing that the story of this night might not yet be finished being written. "Why do you care?" he asked me, quiet enough that only I could hear it over the idling wagon. "You don't know me. I hit you with my kid's bat an hour ago. Why does any of this matter to you?" I did not have a tidy answer for him then. I have a better one now, built from everything that happened in the weeks that followed, but standing in that lane with my forearm throbbing and a bruise already blooming purple beneath my sleeve, all I had was the truth as I understood it in that moment. "Because I've stood a lot of quiet posts," I told him, waiting for something bad to happen so I'd finally have a reason to matter. And tonight something bad happened, and it turned out the something bad was just a man trying to feed his kids who ran out of every good option before he ran out of night. "That's not nothing to me, Walter. That's not nothing at all." They took him then, and the wagon pulled away down the lane with its lights sweeping briefly across the shuttered market stalls, and I stood alone by the cracked crate lid with a child's bat in my hands, and the whole rest of that night still ahead of me, filling out reports, having my arm looked at by the palace physician, filing an incident statement that I already knew I was going to have to write very, very carefully if it was going to say everything I needed it to say. I did not know yet what I was going to do about Walter Finn. I only knew, standing there in the cold with dawn still hours away, that I was not prepared to let his story end in that lane, on that report, as a simple case of a thug and a bat and a guard who'd done his duty and gone home. I was wrong about a great many small things over the weeks that followed. I was not wrong about that. The palace physician, a brisk, unhurried woman named Dr. Iseult Price, who had set more guardsmen's bones than she could likely count, pronounced my forearm badly bruised but unbroken, wrapped it tighter than I thought strictly necessary, and told me to expect it to ache for a fortnight and to stop flexing it every 10 seconds to test whether it still worked. I sat afterward in the small report room off the kitchen gate guardhouse with a cup of tea going cold at my elbow and a blank incident form in front of me, and I found myself staring at the boxes I was meant to fill in: nature of incident, force used, injuries sustained, disposition of suspect, for a long time before I wrote a single word. There is a way to write an incident report that is entirely true and still manages to say nothing at all about the man at the center of it. Assailant approached crate, resisted apprehension with blunt object, subdued without further incident, transferred to district holding pending charges. Every word of that would have been accurate. It also would have made Walter Finn indistinguishable from any other man who has ever swung something at a guard in the dark. And I found, turning my pen over in my fingers, that I was not willing to write it that way. So I wrote it the long way instead. I wrote what he had told me about the warehouse closing and the 4 months of unanswered applications, about his wife's untreated fever, and the 2 daughters staying with an aunt because there was no one left at home fit to look after them, about the 6 minutes that had cost him the relief office's window, and the child's bat with her name still legible on the barrel. I wrote that in my professional judgment, having disarmed and questioned the suspect directly, I did not believe he presented an ongoing danger to any person, and I recommended that whatever charges were filed take full account of the circumstances I had documented. It took me the better part of an hour, and by the time I finished, the tea beside me had gone entirely cold, and the first gray edge of actual dawn was showing through the guardhouse window. I was still there, reading back over what I had written, when Captain Reeve Farrow came through the door. I should explain who Captain Farrow was to me, because he matters a great deal to how the rest of this went. He had commanded the company I served in for 4 of my 11 years, a broad-shouldered, silver-haired man who had come up through the ranks the hard way, and who ran his company on a very simple, very old-fashioned understanding of what a guard was for. You stand where you are told, you follow the rule exactly as written, and you let the rule protect both the crown and the man standing under it, because the moment a guard starts deciding for himself which rules apply to which people, the whole structure the uniform is meant to represent starts to wobble. I respected him more than almost any man I had served under. I also knew, the instant he set eyes on the report in my hand and the particular stillness in my face, that he was not going to be pleased with what I had written. Ashcombe. He took the chair across from me without being asked, the way senior officers do, and held out a hand for the report. I gave it to him. He read it in silence, his face giving away nothing until he reached the 3rd paragraph, at which point one gray eyebrow rose very slightly and stayed there. "You're recommending leniency," he said when he'd finished, "for a man who assaulted a guard with a weapon." "I'm recommending the truth be part of the record," I said. "What happens with that truth isn't mine to decide. I'm not asking anyone to let him walk free, Captain. I'm asking that whoever decides his fate knows what actually happened in that lane, instead of the 4 flat lines it would take to describe it the easy way. Pharaoh set the report down on the table between us and studied me for a long moment, the kind of look he gave new recruits when he was deciding whether they understood the weight of what they'd signed up for. "You know how this looks," he said. "A guard gets struck on duty, and instead of writing it up clean, he spends an hour building a sympathetic case for the man who struck him. There are people in this chain of command who are going to read that report and wonder whether you're fit to have handled this alone. There are people who are going to wonder whether next time, facing a man with an actual weapon and actual intent, that same instinct to find the sympathetic angle costs you more than a bruised arm. With respect, Captain, I disarmed him in under 2 seconds and used no more force than was needed to put him on the ground. Nobody's questioning whether I can do my job in the moment. I did it. I'm asking whether, once the moment's over, I'm allowed to still see the man in front of me as a man." I met his eyes and did not look away, though it cost me something to hold that stillness against a superior officer's plain disapproval. "You taught me that the uniform protects the rule so the rule can protect the people under it. I've never forgotten that. But I don't think the rule was ever meant to be blind to a man's daughter's name written on the thing he swung at me. I think that's exactly the kind of detail the rule is supposed to make room for, or what's the rule even for?" Pharaoh was quiet for a long moment. Outside the small window, the last of the delivery trucks I'd been half listening for all night finally rumbled through the kitchen gate, right on schedule, as though the whole city had simply gone on turning around the wreck of Walter Finn's evening, without noticing it had happened at all. "You'll write nothing further about this without clearing it through me," Pharaoh said finally, and there was something in his voice that was not quite permission and not quite refusal, the voice of a man reserving judgment rather than delivering a verdict. "The report stands as filed. I won't strike a word of it because you're right that it's true, and I don't ask my guards to lie in their paperwork even by omission. But Ashcombe, I want you to hear me clearly on this next part. Sympathy is not your job. Your job ends the moment that man is in the constable's custody. Whatever happens to him after that belongs to the magistrate's court, not to you. If I hear that you've gone chasing after this on your own time, inserting yourself into a criminal matter that isn't yours to insert yourself into, I will have a very different conversation with you than this one. Do you understand?" "Yes, Captain," I said, and I meant it in that moment as sincerely as I have ever meant an answer to a superior officer. I want to be honest about that too, because it would be a tidier story if I could tell you I walked out of that guardhouse already resolved to defy him. I did not. I walked out intending to do exactly what he'd told me, file my report, let the machinery of the court do what the machinery of the court does, and go back to standing my quiet posts. What changed my mind was a single detail that would not leave me alone. It came to me 3 days later on my day off, while I was sitting at my own kitchen table doing nothing more significant than mending a torn seam on my dress uniform's cuff. A small, mindless task, the kind that leaves the mind entirely free to wander wherever it wants to go. And where mine went, unbidden, again and again, was to the number Walter Finn had said in that lane with his voice cracking clean in half. 6 minutes. He had stood outside a glass door and watched a woman turn a sign around. 6 minutes too late to get his family the help that might have kept this whole catastrophe from ever happening. And he had spent what remained of that day replaying those 6 minutes as though sheer force of regret could somehow buy them back. I thought about my own father's winter at the shipyard, and about the fact that nobody, not one soul in that whole cold season, had ever sat down across from him and asked what he actually needed, because in our part of the city, you did not ask a proud man that question. You let him keep his dignity, and you hoped he found his own way through. I had grown up believing that was simply how it was done, that mercy meant looking away from a man's hardship rather than looking directly at it. I was 31 years old, sitting at my kitchen table with a needle in my hand, before it occurred to me that perhaps that belief had never actually served anyone. That my father might have found his way through that winter a great deal faster, and with a great deal less silent damage done to the family sitting around him at supper every night, if even one person had simply asked him what he needed and then helped him get it. I put down the needle. I sat there for a long while with the half-mended cuff in my lap, and then I got up, put on my coat, and went to find out what had happened to Walter Finn. The district holding facility sat 4 streets back from the main courthouse, a squat gray building that processed most of the city's minor arrests before they were sorted into whatever came next: release, formal charge, transfer to await trial. I was not strictly permitted to visit a detained man outside of an official capacity, and I want to be honest that I stretched that permission further than it was meant to stretch, presenting myself at the front desk as the arresting guard following up on a filed report, which was true, while allowing the duty clerk to assume it was a procedural visit, which was not entirely. I do not offer that as an excuse. I offer it only because it matters later, that I understood from the very beginning I was walking a line, and chose to walk it anyway. They brought Walter Finn into a visiting room separated from me by a table and very little else. No glass, no bars, just a scarred wooden table and 2 chairs, and a guard posted at the door out of habit rather than necessity, since Walter Finn, even now, did not look like a man capable of causing anyone trouble. He looked worse than he had in the lane, if that was possible. 3 days in a holding cell had hollowed him out further, and when he saw who had come to see him, something in his face flickered between confusion and a wariness so deep it was almost its own kind of exhaustion. "You," he said, sitting down slowly across from me. "I didn't think nobody said a guard was coming. I figured I wouldn't see you again till a courtroom, if then." "I'm not here officially," I told him, which was as close to the truth as I was willing to get out loud. "I wanted to know how you were, and I wanted to know how your wife is doing. Myrle, that was her name, wasn't it?" Something moved behind his eyes at the sound of her name in my mouth, surprise, maybe, that I had remembered it at all, or something closer to pain that I had thought to ask. "She's worse," he said quietly. "My sister-in-law's been sitting with her since that night. She won't say it plain, my sister-in-law, but I can hear it in how she talks around it on the phone. Myrle needs a doctor properly, not the free clinic handing her a slip of paper she can't afford to fill. And I'm sitting in here, and there's nothing I can do about any of it, and every day I'm in here is a day closer to losing the apartment for good, because the landlord's not going to wait on rent for a man in custody, whatever the reason." He pressed both hands flat against the scarred table as though bracing it or himself against something. "You want to know how I am? I'm exactly as bad as you'd expect. I lie awake at night, there's not much else to do in here, and I think about my girls not understanding where I've gone, and I think about the fact that I did this to myself, that whatever happens now I put myself here. I swung a bat at a king's guard. I don't get to be the victim in this story. I know that." "I never said you were the victim," I said. "You did something genuinely dangerous, Walter, and there are real consequences coming for it, and nothing I'm about to say changes that. But I don't think a man has to be entirely innocent to still deserve to be seen clearly. And I don't think he did something wrong, and he deserves a chance to make it right properly with real help, are opposite ideas. I think most of the men I've dealt with in this uniform want them to be opposites because it's simpler that way. I'm not sure it's true." He looked at me for a long moment, and I watched him decide, slowly, cautiously, to let himself hope for something he had clearly trained himself over the last 3 days not to hope for at all. "Why are you really here?" he asked. I told him then, as plainly as I could, what I had been turning over since that night, that I did not believe he belonged in a cell awaiting the harshest sentence the law allowed, that I believed the court would be far better served, and so would the city, and so would his daughters, by a resolution that held him properly accountable while also giving him an actual way back onto his feet. I told him I did not yet know what that would look like, or whether I could accomplish any of it, but that I intended to try, starting with finding out what real help existed for a family in his situation, and whether I had any standing at all to connect him to it. "There's a fund," I said. "St. Bevan's Relief House administers a hardship trust the Crown quietly supports. I know a little about it because 2 of the men I serve alongside have family who have used it. It's meant for exactly this, a family that's fallen through every ordinary crack. I don't know if it can move fast enough to help Myrle now this week, but I intend to find out today. And there's a man at the Palace stores, a master cooper named Corin Vane, who I happen to know has been short-handed in the cellarage for the better part of a year, and has said as much to anyone who will listen. You said you worked a loading floor 11 years. That's not nothing to a man who needs a hand who can lift and sort and show up on time, and hasn't got the luxury of training someone from scratch." Walter Fenn sat very still across from me, and when he finally spoke, his voice had gone thin and careful, like a man handling something he suspected of being fragile enough to shatter if he held it too tight. "Why would you do any of that for me?" he said, "after what I did to you?" "Because you asked me that same question in the lane," I said, "and I gave you the truest answer I had at the time, and it's still true now. I've stood a great many quiet posts waiting to matter. This is the first time in a long while I've been entirely certain what mattering actually looks like." I stood, because the guard at the door had begun glancing toward us in the particular way that meant my time was drawing to a close. "I'm not promising you an outcome, Walter. I can't. What happens with the court isn't mine to decide, and I won't pretend to you that it is. But I promise you this, nobody handling your case from here forward is going to see 4 flat lines on a form and nothing else. I've made sure of that already, and I intend to make sure of a great deal more before this is finished." I left him there with something in his face that I had not seen since the moment I first looked at him in the lane. Not hope exactly, not yet, but the faint, fragile shape hope takes before it has earned the right to call itself that. I walked out of the holding facility into a gray, ordinary afternoon, and I understood, with the particular clarity that comes from finally admitting a thing to yourself, that I had just committed to something Captain Farrow had explicitly warned me against 3 days earlier, and that I did not intend to stop. I had no idea, that afternoon, how much harder the next several weeks were going to make me work to keep that promise. I started with St. Bevan's, because it seemed the most urgent thread to pull. The relief house sat on the quieter side of the district, an old stone building that had served the city's poor in one form or another for longer than anyone currently working there could tell you with certainty. Its hardship trust funded partly by the Crown, and partly by a slow, steady trickle of private giving that the palace never publicized and never took credit for. I went there on my next full day off, out of uniform, and spoke to a caseworker named Mrs. Aldith Prine, a small, sharp-eyed woman who had clearly heard every version of every hard-luck story the city had to offer and had trained herself, out of necessity, not to be moved by the telling alone. She was not unmoved in the end by Walter Fenn's case, but she was, appropriately, cautious about it, and she made me understand within the first 10 minutes of our conversation exactly how these things actually worked, as opposed to how I had naively imagined they might. "We don't hand money to a stranger because a guard vouches for him, Mr. Ashcombe, however well meant the vouching," she told me, not unkindly, across a desk stacked with case files that made Walter Fenn's suddenly feel like one small tributary in a much larger river of need. "We have a process, and the process exists because the trust has to last for the next family and the family after that, not just for the one whose story happens to reach us first through someone with a uniform and a conscience. I need an application. I need to verify the circumstances, the job loss, the wife's illness, the children's living situation. I need to interview the family myself. Only after that can the trust's board consider an emergency disbursement, and even an emergency disbursement, properly processed, takes the better part of 2 weeks. His wife may not have 2 weeks, I said. Not if what he's telling me about her condition is accurate. Mrs. Prine's face did not soften exactly, but something in it sharpened with a different kind of attention. Then you'd better make sure I can verify it quickly, she said, because there is one path faster than the standard process, and it exists for exactly this kind of urgency. But it requires someone with standing to formally attest to the emergency in writing and to accept a measure of personal responsibility if the attestation proves false. Are you prepared to put your name to that, Mr. Ashcombe? Because I will tell you plainly, this is no longer you being kind to a man in a lane. This is you staking something of your own reputation on a family you met 3 days ago. I sat with that question longer than I am proud to admit. I thought of Captain Farrow's warning, still fresh enough to sting. I thought of the particular way careers in the Guard were built slowly on reliability, on the accumulated weight of 1,000 quiet, correct decisions, and how quickly all of that could be undone by one decision that looked, from the outside, like poor judgment. And then I thought of Walter Finn's voice cracking on the word 6 minutes, and of a bat with a child's name worn into the wood, and I told Mrs. Prine that yes, I was prepared to put my name to it. She had me write and sign an attestation on the spot, a formal statement of the circumstances as I had witnessed and verified them, my professional standing offered as surety for its accuracy, and told me she would present it to the Trust's board within 2 days. I make no promises, she said, sliding the paper into a folder already thick with Walter Finn's name on its tab. But I will tell you this much, since you've clearly never sat where I sit. Most people who come through that door asking for help for a stranger disappear the moment the process gets slow and inconvenient. You came back a second time before I even asked you to. That tells me more than the paperwork does. From St. Bevan's I went, that same afternoon, to the Palace stores, where I found Master Corin Vane exactly where I expected to, down among the long racks of aging casks in the palace cellarage. A broad, weathered man in his 60s with forearms like a much younger man's, and the particular unhurried patience of someone who has spent 40 years working with wood and wine, and has learned that neither responds well to being rushed. I had known him casually for years, the way you come to know the men who keep a palace actually running behind its ceremonial face, and when I explained why I had come, he did not so much as pause in his work, only listened with his head tilted slightly while he checked the seal on a cask that, by his own account, had been resting undisturbed since before I was born. A loading floor man, 11 years, good hands, shows up on time, he said when I'd finished. Doran, I have been asking this palace for a second hand down here since the spring, and every request I've filed has come back with a note about budget review. You're telling me you found me a man who can lift and sort and knows the rhythm of a working floor, and the only complication is he's presently sitting in the district holding facility for swinging a bat at you. That's the shape of it, yes. Master Vane straightened, wiped his hands on the leather apron he wore, and regarded me for a long moment with an expression I could not entirely read. You know, he said finally, I lost my own position once, a long time before you knew me. Younger man's mistake, trusted a business partner I shouldn't have, watched the whole enterprise collapse out from under both of us inside a year. I remember exactly what it does to a man, watching every door he knocks on stay shut. Somebody gave me a second one, eventually, or I wouldn't be standing in this cellar telling you about it. He considered a moment longer. I can't hire a man with active criminal charges hanging over him, Doran. That's not stubbornness. That's simply how the palace's own hiring rules work, and I don't get to bend them any more than you get to bend yours. But if this Walter Finn comes out the other side of whatever the court decides with a clean enough record to be hired at all, restitution paid, no custodial sentence, the charge resolved in a way that doesn't bar him from Crown employment, you tell him the position's his to interview for. I'll hold it as long as I reasonably can. That's the honest most I can offer you today. It was not nothing. It was, in fact, considerably more than I had dared hope for from a single afternoon's asking, and I left the cellarage with the first genuine warmth I had felt in days. The sense, however fragile, that the pieces of a real path forward for Walter Fenn were beginning, however slowly, to exist in the world. I want to be honest, though, that the next several weeks were not a straight climb toward that warmth. They were, more often, a series of small, grinding setbacks, each of which taught me something about how much harder it is to actually help a family in crisis than it is to want to help them. The first setback came within the week, when I went again on my own time, again stretching the outer edge of what Captain Farrow had permitted, to visit Walter Fenn's apartment and check on his wife directly, having grown uneasy at the vagueness of what he'd told me about her condition from behind the holding facility's scarred table. His sister-in-law, a tired, wary woman named Sella who eyed my uniform with open suspicion when she opened the door, let me in only after I explained twice that I was not there in any official capacity and that Walter had spoken of her with real gratitude. The apartment was small and threadbare, but carefully kept, the particular cleanliness of people trying hard to hold on to dignity even as everything around them frayed. Myrtle Fenn was propped up in the apartment's single bedroom on a stack of pillows, and I will not pretend the sight of her did not shake me, her breathing audible from the doorway, a rattling, effortful sound, her face pale in a way that spoke of days without proper rest or proper food, let alone proper medicine. Two small girls sat on the floor near the bed's foot, working quietly at some shared drawing, and the elder of them, Etta, I would learn, 9 years old and clearly aware, in the particular unchildish way that hardship forces onto children too early, that something in her family's world had gone badly wrong, looked up at me with an expression that held more wariness than any 9-year-old's face should have to hold. I did not stay long. I did not want to frighten the girls further, and I did not want to overstep the very narrow space Sella had grudgingly opened for me. But I spoke briefly with Myrtle, who managed, between labored breaths, to thank me for what her husband had told her I was trying to do, and who asked me, with a directness that startled me, whether I thought Walter was going to prison. I don't know yet, I told her, because it would have been cruel and untrue to promise her otherwise. I'm doing everything I know how to do to make sure that isn't the outcome, but I won't lie to you and tell you it's decided. It isn't. He's not a bad man, she said, and had to stop and cough, a deep, wet sound that made both girls look up sharply from their drawing before returning, with visible effort to pretending they hadn't. Whatever he did that night, he's the best man I've ever known, guardsman. He'd have cut off his own hand before he hurt someone, any ordinary day of his life. I don't know what that night did to him. I've never seen him like that. Not once, not in 12 years. I left the apartment with Sella's wary eyes on my back, and a weight in my chest that had nothing to do with my still-aching forearm, and I went directly, without stopping first to change out of the plain coat I'd worn to avoid frightening the girls, to the free clinic Walter had described, to ask, as a private citizen, not as a guard, though I did not entirely manage to keep the uniform's authority out of my voice when I needed it, what it would actually take to get a home visit and a proper course of treatment moving for a woman in Myrtle Fenn's condition. It took the better part of 2 hours of patient, occasionally frustrating negotiation, but I left with a nurse's promise to visit within 2 days and a prescription that, notably, was not going to fill itself. That was the moment I made a decision I have thought about many times since, turning it over from every angle, testing whether I would make it again. I paid for the medicine myself. It was not a large sum, not by the measure of a guard's steady wage, though it was not nothing either enough that I noticed its absence from my own accounts for the following month. I did not tell Walter. I did not tell Mrs. Prine at St. Bevan's, not wanting it to complicate the trust's own review of the case. I told no one at all, in fact, except Sella, who accepted the filled prescription at the apartment door with a look that shifted slowly, from suspicion into something closer to recognition. The recognition of a woman who has learned to sort the people who talk about helping from the very much smaller number who simply do it. I do not offer that detail to present myself as some particular kind of hero. I offer it because it is true, and because leaving it out would make the rest of this story sound tidier and more official than it actually was. Sometimes the help a man needs cannot wait for a process, however well-intentioned the process is, and a man with a steady wage and no family of his own to provide for has to decide, in the moment, whether he is willing to close that gap himself. I decided that I would decide it again. The second and far harder setback came 10 days later, and it did not come from bureaucracy or from money at all. It came from Walter Finn himself. I had gone back to the holding facility to update him on what progress there was. Mrs. Prine's cautious optimism about the trust's emergency review, Master Vane's conditional promise of an interview, Meyer's improving color under the nurse's care, which I described to him in a way that let him believe the clinic's ordinary charity had simply, finally worked in his favor rather than admitting my own hand in it. I expected, walking in, that this news would be the first real light Walter Finn had seen in nearly 2 weeks. Instead, I found him sitting across the scarred table with his jaw set in a way I had not seen on him before, something closed and stubborn, where there had only ever been exhaustion and shame. "I've decided something," he told me before I'd even finished sitting down. "I'm going to plead guilty to everything straight, no defense, no mitigating circumstances presented. I want you to stop what you're doing. All of it, the fun, the job, whatever you said to that man in the cellarage. I appreciate it, guardsman, more than I know how to say, but I want you to stop." I sat back genuinely startled. "Why?" "Because I don't deserve it," he said, and the words came out of him hard and fast, like something he'd been rehearsing alone in a cell for days and could not hold in any longer. "I keep thinking about it. Every night in here I keep thinking about it. You didn't do anything wrong that night. You were doing your job, walking your post, same as any other night, and I came out of the dark and swung a bat at your head because I couldn't hold myself together. That's on me. Not on the warehouse that let me go, not on the woman who turned the sign around 6 minutes early, not on anybody but me. And now I've got you risking your own name at that trust, and some cooper holding a job for a man who might not even be worth the risk, and I keep thinking, what if I take all that help and I mess it up anyway? What if I'm just not the kind of man who deserves a second chance, and everybody who tried to give me one ends up looking like a fool for trying?" He shook his head hard, as though trying to physically dislodge the thought. "It's easier if I just take what's coming, plead guilty, take whatever sentence the magistrate gives me, and let everybody who tried to help me go back to their own lives without me hanging around their conscience." I understood, sitting there, that I was looking at something I recognized from my own family's history, though it took me a moment to place it. It was not really about guilt at all, not entirely. It was shame wearing guilt's clothing, the particular, corrosive conviction, one I had watched settle over my own father that long ago winter, that a man who has failed once has forfeited the right to be helped ever again, that accepting kindness from people who saw him at his worst is somehow a second humiliation worse than the first. I had seen my father refuse an offered loan from his own brother that winter for exactly that reason, out of a pride so wounded it had curdled into something that looked, from the outside, almost like stubbornness. And I had watched, as a boy too young to understand what he was watching, the slow damage that refusal did to the whole family sitting quiet around the supper table in the months that followed. "Walter," I said, and I made myself say it slowly, because I understood that how I said this mattered as much as what I said. "I want you to listen to me carefully, because I don't think anyone has said this to you plainly enough yet. Deserving has nothing to do with it." He looked up at me, something raw and startled in his face. "You didn't earn a second chance by being a good enough man," I told him. "None of us earn that, not really, not the way you mean it, not by some accounting where the good outweighs the bad enough to qualify. You get a second chance because a handful of people looked at the whole of what happened, not just the worst 5 seconds of it, and decided you were worth the risk anyway. That's not charity keeping score of whether you deserve it. That's just what mercy is, Walter. It's not owed, it's given. And refusing it because you're afraid of failing the people who gave it to you, that's not humility. That's just fear wearing a nobler face. He did not answer right away. He sat with his hands flat on the table, breathing slowly, and I watched something in his stubborn jaw begin, very gradually, to loosen. "What if I do fail?" he said finally, very quietly. "What if Vane gives me that interview and I mess it up out of nerves? What if the fund comes through and I can't make it stretch far enough and we're right back where we started in 6 months? What then? What happens to you, standing behind all of it, if I turn out not to be worth what you've staked on me?" "Then I'll have been wrong about one man one time," I said, "and I'll live with that because I'd rather be wrong having tried than right having never bothered. But Walter, I don't think you understand yet how rare it actually is. A man who spends 2 weeks in a cell more worried about failing the people trying to help him than about his own sentence. That tells me something. It tells me exactly the opposite of what you're afraid it tells me." I do not know, even now, exactly which words finally reached him. I suspect it was not any single sentence, but the accumulated weight of someone simply refusing to leave, refusing to accept his refusal, in the same patient, unmoved way I had once held a wrist lock in a dark lane and would not let go. Whatever it was, by the time the guard at the door signaled that my visit was ending, Walter Finn had agreed, with visible reluctance and visible relief both at once, to let his attorney, a tired, overworked public defender named Mr. Caswell, who had barely had time to review the file, present the full circumstances at whatever hearing eventually came, rather than pleading guilty and walking into sentencing with no defense at all. It was not, I want to be clear, a victory yet. It was only the narrowest possible thing, a man agreeing not to sabotage his own second chance before it had even been offered to him. But walking out of that holding facility that afternoon, I understood that it had been, in its own way, the hardest ground I had gained yet, harder than the trust's paperwork, harder than Master Vane's cautious promise. Because everything else I had done in the 2 weeks since that lane had been about opening doors on Walter Finn's behalf. That conversation had been about convincing him he was still allowed to walk through one. Word came from St. Bevan's 4 days later, and for the first time since the whole business began, it was unambiguously good. Mrs. Prine summoned me to her office to tell me, with the careful, unsentimental satisfaction of a woman who has spent a career guarding against exactly the kind of misplaced sympathy that wastes a trust's limited resources, that the board had approved an emergency disbursement, enough to cover 2 months of back rent, keeping the Finn family's apartment out of eviction proceedings, and to establish a standing account at the free clinic sufficient to see Myrle through a full course of treatment without the family having to choose, week to week, between medicine and food. "I want to be plain with you about why," Mrs. Prine said, closing the folder with something that might, on a less guarded woman, have passed for satisfaction. "It wasn't your attestation alone, though it helped. It was that when my caseworker visited the apartment, the elder girl, Etta, I believe, asked her, unprompted, whether her father was going to be able to come home in time for her birthday. 9 years old, and already doing the arithmetic of what a court date might cost her. That's the kind of detail that moves a board faster than any form I could file. This family needed help before your Mr. Finn ever picked up that bat, Mr. Ashcombe. He simply fell through every crack that existed until the falling itself became a crime. That's not an excuse for what he did. But it is, I think, an indictment of how many good people can fall a very long way before anyone with the standing to help happens to notice." I carried that news to Walter myself, and I will not try to describe in any detail what his face did when I told him his family's rent was secure and his wife's treatment paid through, only that he put both hands over his face at the table and sat like that for a long moment, his shoulders shaking in a way that had nothing left in it of the panic I'd seen in the lane, and everything in it of a man finally allowed to set down a weight he had been carrying so long he'd half forgot it was possible to put it anywhere. I would like to tell you that from there the path ran smooth and downhill to the courtroom. It did not. 2 obstacles remained, and the first of them very nearly cost me more than I had bargained on losing. The greengrocer whose crate Walter had tried to pry open, a heavy-set, no-nonsense woman named Bet Cormoran, who had run her stall at Cooper's Row for over 20 years, had, understandably, been furious when she first learned of the attempted theft, and had told Constable Osler in no uncertain terms that she wanted the fullest charge, the law allowed pressed against the man who damaged her crate, and in her words, tried to rob a woman who's never once shorted a hungry customer who asked nicely instead of sneaking around in the dark like a thief. I went to see her myself, on the same stretch of my own time I had spent on everything else, and found her exactly as formidable in person as her reputation suggested, a woman who did not soften for a uniform and did not intend to start. "You want me to feel sorry for him," she said, arms crossed over her apron, before I'd gotten 3 sentences into my explanation. "I've heard sad stories before, guardsman. Half the district's got one. Doesn't mean I let every one of them help himself to my stock." "I'm not asking you to feel sorry for him," I said. "I'm asking you to hear what actually happened, and then decide for yourself what's fair. He's willing to pay full restitution for the crate and the damage to the lid. The trust that's helping his family has agreed to cover it if he can't manage it himself, so you won't be waiting on a man with no income to make you whole. And if you're willing to decline pressing the theft charge separately, the assault charge will still stand entirely on its own. Nothing about that goes easier because of what you decide. You lose nothing by hearing the whole of it, Mrs. Cormoran. You only stand to gain a fuller picture before you decide what kind of woman you want to be remembered as in this." She did not answer right away. She looked at me for a long moment with the particular sharp assessment of a woman who has spent 2 decades reading customers at a glance, and then, grudgingly, she asked me to tell her the whole of it: the warehouse, the fever, the 6 minutes, the bat with a child's name on it. By the end, her crossed arms had loosened, and though she did not go so far as warmth, she agreed, with a gruffness that did not entirely disguise what lay beneath it, to accept restitution and decline to press the separate theft charge, leaving the matter to rest on the assault charge alone. "Tell him," she said as I turned to go, "that if he ever finds himself that desperate again, he knocks on my shutter instead of prying at my crate. I've fed hungrier men than him for free before now when they had the sense to ask instead of sneak. Foolish man, foolish, proud, foolish man." And then more quietly, almost to herself, "Not the worst kind of foolish, though. Not by half." That victory, however, came at nearly the same moment as the second obstacle, and this one struck considerably closer to home. Captain Farrow summoned me to his office 10 days before the scheduled hearing, and the moment I saw the folder open on his desk, I understood that someone, likely someone at the Crown Prosecutor's office, who had noticed an unusual amount of activity clustering around what should have been a straightforward assault case, had begun asking pointed questions about a guard who seemed to have inserted himself rather thoroughly into a defendant's rehabilitation before that defendant had even been formally charged. "I warned you," Farrow said, and there was no anger in his voice, which somehow made it worse than if there had been only a kind of tired, disappointed certainty, the voice of a man watching a prediction come true against his own wishes. "I told you your job ended when he went into custody. Instead, I've had an inquiry land on my desk this morning asking whether Guardsman Doran Ashcombe has an inappropriate personal relationship with a man he arrested, whether you've been using your position, your standing, possibly Crown resources, to build a defense case for a man who put you on the ground with a weapon. Do you understand how that reads, Ashcombe? Do you understand what that could cost you if a review board decides your judgment can't be trusted? I stood at something close to attention, though it was not required of me in that small office, because standing straight was, in that moment, the only thing keeping the fear in my chest from reaching my voice. I understand exactly how it reads, Captain. I'd ask you to let me tell you how it actually is, and then judge for yourself whether they're the same thing. I told him everything then, in a way I had not fully laid out for him before: the attestation at St. Bevan's, the conversation with Master Vane, the visit to Myrle Fenn's bedside, the medicine I had paid for out of my own pocket and told no one about until this moment, the conversation in the holding facility where Walter had tried to plead guilty and forfeit every chance offered to him, and my own reasons, reaching back to a cold winter in my father's house, for refusing to let him. Pharaoh listened without interrupting, his face unreadable, and when I finished, the silence in the small office stretched long enough that I genuinely did not know, standing in it, which way his judgment was going to fall. "You paid for the medicine yourself," he said finally. Not a question, a fact he was turning over. "Yes, Captain." "And told no one, because you didn't want it complicating the trust's review, or looking like you were trying to buy yourself a good outcome." "Yes, Captain." He was quiet again for a long moment, and then he did something I had not expected. He closed the folder on his desk, sat back in his chair, and regarded me with an expression that had shed most of its earlier disappointment and replaced it with something more complicated. "I served 31 years in this uniform before I made captain," he said. "I have watched a great many guards learn, the hard way, that sympathy makes a poor substitute for discipline. I have also, in those same 31 years, watched a smaller number of guards learn something rarer. That discipline, without any room left in it for mercy, eventually curdles into something the uniform was never meant to stand for. I don't know yet which lesson you're teaching me, Ashcombe. I confess I came into this conversation fairly certain it was the first. I am considerably less certain now." "What happens now, Captain?" "Now," Pharaoh said, "I go back to whoever sent me that inquiry and tell them that I have personally reviewed the matter, that no Crown resources were misused, that your conduct in the field the night of the incident was exemplary and by the book, and that whatever you've done since, on your own time and at your own expense, is the private business of a private citizen and none of the guard's affair, so long as it stays that way." He held my eyes for a long beat. "But I want to be clear with you, Ashcombe, that I am spending something to say that. My own standing, a little of it, on the strength of my judgment about yours. I would ask that you not make me regret it." "I won't, Captain," I said, and meant it as fully as I had ever meant anything in 11 years of service. "One more thing." He was already reaching for another file on his desk, the conversation closing the way his conversations always closed, briskly, without lingering. "The king has been made aware, in general terms, of an incident at the kitchen gate and of a guard's subsequent conduct regarding it. Not the particulars, I've kept those where they belong, in this office and the courts, not spread through the palace as gossip." But His Majesty asked, when the matter crossed his desk in the routine incident summary, whether the guard involved was the same Ashcombe who'd served the East Wing detail 2 winters past. I told him it was. He said nothing further. I mention it only so you understand that more eyes than you know are aware of how this resolves, Ashcombe. Conduct yourself accordingly. I left that office with my pulse still not fully settled, understanding for the first time the true size of the risk I had been running these past weeks, not merely to Walter Fenn's future, but to my own 11 years of quiet, careful reputation, staked without my ever quite deciding to stake it, on the conviction that a man's worst 5 seconds should not be allowed to stand as the whole of what he was. The hearing was 3 days away. I had done everything I knew how to do. What remained now was simply to walk into that courtroom and find out whether it had been enough. The Harrowgate District Courtroom was smaller than its name suggested. A plain, high-windowed room with worn wooden benches, and the particular hush of a place where the ordinary business of other people's worst days is conducted with brisk, impersonal efficiency. I arrived early in my dress uniform and took a seat near the front where I would be visible when the defense called me, and I watched the room fill slowly around me. Mrs. Prine from St. Bevan's, folder in hand. Master Vane, out of his cellarage apron and looking somehow larger and more solemn in an ordinary coat. Sella arriving with Myrle on her arm, thinner than I remembered but upright, breathing easier. Her color returned enough that I felt something in my chest unclench at the sight of her walking under her own strength. The girls had been left, mercifully, with a neighbor for the day. A courtroom, whatever its outcome, was no place for them. Walter Fenn was brought in from a side door in plain clothes rather than a prisoner's garb, at Mr. Caswell's request, and I watched him search the room the moment he entered, his eyes finding Myrle first. A long look passed between them that held more in it than I could begin to describe, and then, a moment later, finding me. He did not smile. There was nothing in that moment that called for a smile. But something in his shoulders eased a fraction, the way a man's shoulders ease when he confirms, against every fear that has kept him awake for weeks, that the people who said they would be there actually came. Magistrate Aldous Prynne presided, a lean, silver-haired man whose reputation, Mr. Caswell had warned me quietly beforehand, ran toward the strict rather than the lenient. A magistrate who took assault against a guard seriously as a matter of principle, believing, not without reason, that a city's order depended on its citizens understanding there were lines that could not be crossed without real consequence. I understood, watching him take his seat and open the file before him with brisk, unhurried precision, that whatever hope I carried into that room was not going to be handed to us. It was going to have to be earned, in full, in the next hour. The Crown prosecutor laid out the charges plainly and without exaggeration: assault against a member of the King's Guard while performing his duties, a serious offense carrying, under the standard sentencing guidelines, a custodial term of not less than 18 months. He noted fairly that the defendant had cooperated fully since his arrest, had shown no history of prior offense, and had made full restitution to the affected merchant. He did not ask for leniency. That was not his role. He asked simply that the court weigh the seriousness of the act against whatever mitigating circumstances the defense chose to present. Then it was Mr. Caswell's turn, and though he was, by his own admission, an overworked public defender carrying triple the caseload any one attorney should reasonably manage, he had done, in the weeks since Walter agreed not to plead guilty outright, more careful work than I think either of us had expected of him, assembling St. Bevan's formal letter confirming the emergency disbursement and the trust's ongoing commitment to the family's stability. Master Vane's written offer of conditional employment pending the case's resolution, Dr. Price's brief note regarding Myrle's treatment and recovery, and finally, my own statement, which he asked me to deliver directly to the court. I had not slept well the night before, turning over in my mind exactly what I would say, and in the end I abandoned every rehearsed version and simply told the magistrate the truth as I had lived it. The shape moving wrong among the market stalls, the swing that never should have connected, but for a half-second of blind panic, the child's name worn into the bat's grip, the 6 minutes that had cost a man his family's last safety net. The 2 weeks of watching a stranger's shame nearly convince him he deserved no help at all. I told the magistrate that I had been struck by Walter Fenn, that the injury, though minor, was real, and that I did not stand before the court asking that the seriousness of that act be minimized. I told him, too, that in 11 years of service I had learned to read the difference between a man capable of real, calculated violence and a man whose whole life had, for one terrible night, simply run out of road beneath him, and that I believed, as certainly as I had ever believed anything in this uniform, that Walter Fenn was the second kind of man. not the first. Your Honor, I said near the end, I am not asking this court to pretend nothing happened in that lane. Something happened. I carried the mark of it on my arm for 2 weeks, and I will carry the memory of it considerably longer. But I have also spent those same weeks watching this man work harder to become worthy of a second chance than most men I have known work to keep the first one they were handed for free. I believe the city is better served by a sentence that holds him fully accountable, restitution, which is already paid, supervised probation, meaningful community service, while also allowing him to keep the job that's waiting for him and the family that's depending on him, then it would be served by a prison term that guarantees he loses both, and very likely guarantees the same desperation that put a bat in his hand once put something worse in some other man's hand, some other night, when there's no guard standing close enough to stop it in time. The magistrate listened to all of it, my statement, Master Vane's brief, gruff testimony about the position waiting in the cellarage, Mrs. Prine's careful account of the trust's involvement, and finally, Walter Fenn's own words. Delivered standing, his voice unsteady but his eyes never leaving the bench, an apology that held nothing of performance in it and everything of a man who had spent weeks in a cell coming to terms, slowly and painfully, with the full weight of what he had done and what he had nearly lost as a result. Magistrate Prynne took a recess of nearly 40 minutes before returning to deliver his ruling, and I will admit that I spent every one of those minutes in something close to genuine dread, understanding that nothing I had done in the preceding weeks guaranteed anything at all, that a magistrate with a reputation for strictness might yet decide that principle required the full sentence regardless of every circumstance arrayed against it. When he returned, he spoke plainly without theater. I have weighed the seriousness of this offense against the full circumstances presented, he said, and I want to be clear, for the record, that the seriousness is not diminished by the sympathy the circumstances rightly evoke. A man does not earn the right to strike a guard because his life has grown unbearably hard. If that were the standard, this court would have no order left to keep. But I am also required under the law I serve to consider what sentence best serves justice, not merely punishment, but justice in its fuller sense for the victim, for the defendant, and for the city. Both must go on living in together. He looked, for a long moment, directly at Walter Fenn. I am sentencing you to 2 years of supervised probation, during which you will maintain steady employment, submit to regular review by a probation officer, and complete 100 hours of community service, the specifics of which your probation officer will determine. Restitution having already been paid in full, no further financial penalty is imposed. I am suspending the custodial sentence in its entirety, contingent on your full compliance with these terms. Do you understand the conditions I have set? Walter Fenn's voice when he answered had gone entirely to pieces, and he did not try to hide it. Yes, Your Honor, thank you, I understand. Do not thank me, the magistrate said not unkindly. Thank the guardsman who troubled himself to make sure this court saw the whole of you and not merely the worst 5 seconds of a very hard year. Men in his position are under no obligation to do that. Very few of them do. He closed the file before him with a small, final motion. See that you make it worth what he risked on your behalf. This court is adjourned. What happened in the courtroom in the minutes after that ruling is not something I can describe with much dignity, and I have decided I do not especially want to try. There was a great deal of embracing, Myrle reaching her husband first, then the tired weight of Sella's relief, then Master Vane's broad hand landing on Walter's shoulder with a grip that promised the interview, whenever it came, was already as good as decided. I stood somewhat apart from all of it, as I think a guard is meant to, watching a family put itself back together in real time in a plain wooden courtroom, and I felt something in my own chest ease that I had not fully realized, until that moment, had been held tight since the night a shadow moved wrong among the market stalls. Walter Fenn found me before I left. He crossed the room, and for a moment neither of us said anything at all. There did not seem to be words sized correctly for the occasion. And then he simply extended his hand, the same hand that had swung a bat at me in the dark 6 weeks earlier, and I took it. "I don't know how a man says thank you for this," he said. "There isn't a big enough version of it." "You don't have to find one," I told him. "Just do what the magistrate said. Show up. Do the work. Let your girls see their father come home every night the way he's supposed to. That's the thank you, Walter. That's the whole of it." He nodded, and for the first time since I had met him, face down on cold cobblestones with my knee across his shoulders, I watched something settle over him that was not shame, and was not fear, and was not the particular hollow exhaustion of a man out of options. It was, simply, the look of a man who had been given his life back and understood, fully, what it had cost other people to give it to him, and who intended to spend the rest of it proving that cost had been worth paying. I did not see much of Walter Fenn in the weeks immediately after the hearing. That was, in its own way, exactly as it should have been. A man rebuilding a life does not need a guard hovering at his elbow to admire the work. He needs quiet and time, and the ordinary unremarkable business of showing up each day and doing what needs doing. I went back to my own posts, to the long, patient stillness of watching gates that nothing came through, and I found, to my mild surprise, that the work felt different to me now in ways I had not expected. I noticed things I had perhaps stopped fully noticing in 11 years of routine: the particular exhaustion in a delivery driver's shoulders at 4 in the morning, the too careful way certain passers-by counted coins at the market stalls, the small, silent signs of a hard season that a man learns to carry so well that most people walk past it without ever seeing it at all. I do not think that noticing made me a worse guard. I have come, in the time since, to believe rather strongly that it made me a considerably better one. Master Vane held true to his word. Walter interviewed for the cellarage position within a month of the hearing, nervous, by his own later account, in a way he had not been nervous since his very first day on the loading floor 11 years earlier, and was hired within the week, on terms that Master Vane, with characteristic gruffness, described to me afterward as entirely ordinary Doran, nothing charitable about it. The man knows how to work, and I needed a man who knows how to work. Don't go making it into more of a fairy tale than it is. I understood what he meant, and I understood, too, that it was his own quiet way of insisting the story's ending belonged to Walter's competence, and not merely to anyone's mercy. That a second chance, properly given, is not a gift that excuses a man from earning his keep, but simply an open door that a man still has to walk through under his own power. Walter walked through it. I heard over the months that followed, through Master Vane and occasionally through Mrs. Prine, of the steady, unremarkable shape his life slowly took back on probation reviews attended without a single missed appointment, community service hours completed at a shelter not far from St. Bevan's itself, where, I was told, he had become something of a fixture, quietly good with the other men who came through in states, not unlike the one he'd once been in himself. Miles' health returned fully within a few months, the fever and the fear it had carried finally, properly behind her. Etta and Cass came home from their aunts within weeks of the hearing, and I am told, though I did not witness this myself, and would not have presumed to intrude on it if invited, that the first thing Walter did on the evening they returned was to take his younger daughter's baseball bat, cleaned and mended where the courts had finally released it from evidence, and hang it back on its hook by the front door, exactly where it had always belonged. Exactly where it would belong again the following summer when he finally had an evening free enough, and a heart light enough, to take her out to the small patch of grass behind their building and teach her, properly this time, how to hit a ball. I learned of the King's involvement only much later, and even then, only in the smallest, quietest way, which is, I have come to understand, very much how such things are handled at the palace at Harrowgate when they are handled with any real sincerity at all. There was no ceremony. I want to be plain about that, because I know the temptation in telling a story like this one is to end it with trumpets, with some grand public gesture that makes for a satisfying final image. That is not what happened, and I would be doing this whole account a disservice if I pretended otherwise. What happened was this. Some 4 months after the hearing, I was called to a small anteroom off the palace's private wing. Not the state rooms, not anywhere a tourist's camera has ever reached, simply a plain, comfortable room where household business is occasionally conducted away from ceremony, and told that His Majesty wished a brief word. I had served near enough to the royal family over the years to have been in King Alaric's presence perhaps a dozen times, always in the context of formal duty, always at a careful distance appropriate to my rank. This was different. He was alone but for a single attendant, seated in a plain chair rather than anything resembling a throne, and when I was shown in, he rose, which surprised me more than almost anything else that had happened in the whole long affair, because a king does not customarily rise for a guardsman. "Ashcombe," he said, and I understood, from the particular way he said it, that Captain Pharaoh's earlier mention of the king's attention had not been idle. "I've had the fuller account of the matter at the kitchen gate from your captain, some months back now, and I confess it has stayed with me rather more than most incident reports do. I wanted to hear a little of it directly, if you're willing, and to tell you something myself before it slips past being timely." I told him briefly, respectfully, the shape of what had happened, the bat, the crate, the child's name in worn marker, the 6 minutes, the long weeks that followed. He listened the way I imagine few men in his position have the patience left to listen, without interrupting, without hurrying me toward whatever conclusion he had already reached on his own. "I could tell you," he said when I'd finished, "that discipline is the whole of what this crown asks of the men who guard it, and in a great many circumstances, that would be true and important and worth saying plainly. But I did not become king by believing that discipline and mercy sit on opposite sides of some ledger, Ashcombe, each one purchased at the other's expense. I have watched a great many men mistake rigidity for strength, and I have watched a smaller number understand that real strength is the kind that can hold a line and still make room, inside that line, for the particular judgment a moment requires. You held the line that night, you were struck, and you responded with exactly the restraint this uniform demands, no more force than the moment called for, and I want that understood clearly before anything else is said. But you also, afterward, on your own time, at your own cost, chose to see the whole of a man rather than the worst of him, and you did the harder, slower work of proving that seeing him whole did not require excusing what he'd done. That is not a smaller kind of duty than the discipline that put him on the ground in the first place, Ashcombe. I have come to believe, the longer I sit in this position, that it may be the harder kind, and the rarer one. He did not offer me a medal. He did not summon a photographer or announce anything to the household staff, moving quietly through the corridors beyond that plain anteroom's door. He simply extended his hand, as Walter Fenn had once extended his in a courtroom, and I took it, and he held it a moment longer than the formality strictly required, and said, "The crown is fortunate in the men who stand its posts, Ashcombe. I wanted you to hear that from me directly once, even if it never goes further than this room. It never has gone further than that room, not until I chose, much later, to set it down here. I did not tell Walter about it, not for a long while, and when I finally did, over a quiet supper at his own table some 2 years on, with Etta taller and more sure of herself than the wary 9-year-old I remembered from that threadbare bedroom, and Cass old enough now to hold her own bat properly, both hands, elbow up, exactly the way her father had finally had the time and the peace of mind to teach her. He went very quiet for a long moment, turning his fork over in his fingers. "A king said that," he said finally, "because of what happened to me." "A king said that," I told him, "because of what you did afterward, Walter. I only opened a few doors. You're the one who walked through every last one of them, on the hardest days, when it would have been easier by far to sit down in the dark and stop trying. He did not have an answer for that, not in words. But I remember watching him across that small, ordinary table in that small, ordinary apartment, rent paid on time now, a steady wage coming in from the cellarage, his wife laughing at something one of the girls had said, the particular unremarkable warmth of a family that has come, slowly and against real odds, back into its own life. That I understood something I had not fully understood standing over him in that dark lane with my knee across his shoulders, and his daughter's bat spinning away into the shadows. I had spent 11 years believing the whole measure of a guard's worth was in the stillness he could hold against whatever storm came at him, the provocation absorbed without flinching, the discipline that never cracked no matter how hard it was tested. I still believe that stillness matters. I would not have survived that night, or any of the 1,000 quieter nights before it, without it. But I learned something else that year that I had not known to look for before, standing post after post, watching gates that nothing came through. I learned that the stillness is not the whole of the job. It is only ever the beginning of it, the part that keeps you upright long enough to see, clearly, in the one terrible second before everything might go wrong, exactly who is standing in front of you, and exactly what they need from you once the danger has passed. A thug swung a baseball bat at a King's Guard outside a quiet market gate, one late night in Harrowgate, and 1 second later, he regretted it more completely than I think he had ever regretted anything in his life. That much of the story anyone could have written down that night and called it finished, and it would have been true, as far as it went. But it would not have been the whole truth, and I have never much cared for a story that stops at the easy ending when a harder, better one is still waiting to be told. The whole truth is that a desperate man swung a bat in the dark because every ordinary door in his life had quietly closed against him, one after another, until there was nothing left in his hands but a child's toy and a father's blind, wordless terror, and that what mattered most in the long months that followed was not how hard the door of a cell might have closed on him afterward, but how many people, starting with one guard who happened to notice a name worn into old wood, chose instead to hold a different door open until he found, on his own 2 feet, the strength to walk back through it. I still stand my posts. I still watch gates that most nights nothing comes through. But I have never again stood one quite the same way I did before that night, and I do not expect I ever will. I learned, in the space of 1 dark second and everything that followed it, exactly what the stillness was always for.